To begin with, I would like to thank Dean Desker for that extraordinarily generous and entirely undeserved introduction. It is an extraordinary pleasure to be able to give this talk this afternoon. And again, let me reiterate my thanks to the Nyan Gongsi, which makes it possible for me to spend 4 months in the delightful environment of Singapore in general, and Nanyang Technological University, and more appropriately, Rajaratnam School of International Studies in particular. It is a marvelous environment to be working in and to have this opportunity to pursue one's scholarship and to focus on one's intellectual life. It is a rare and unusual opportunity, and I am deeply grateful both to the Nyan Gongsi and to RSIS for making this possible. My talk today is focused on India's quest for great power status, and Dean Desker has very aptly provided a very brief but succinct introduction to the subject. What I intend to do in the next 45 minutes is to divide my talk into 5 distinct segments. First, what I intend to do is to talk about how India embarked on the quest for a great power status between 1947 and 1964. Then there was experienced a long period of stagnation between 64 and 1991. And then from 1991 to the present day has in considerable measure been able to realize its promise as a great power. And then what I intend to do in the last 2 segments is to talk about the achievements of India and how far it has come in terms of its quest for great power status, and then finally conclude by focusing upon the more significant shortcomings and challenges that India continues to face in this long-term quest for great power status. So these constitute the 5 distinct segments of my lecture. The idea of pursuing a great power status really has to be traced back to India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was primus inter pares. There was no one in the Indian cabinet who was as knowledgeable or as interested in matters concerning international affairs and foreign policy as the first Prime Minister of India. He was a man who was extraordinarily erudite and had taken an interest in international affairs as early as the early 1920s. And since he was so knowledgeable about international affairs, few in the Indian cabinet could possibly offer alternatives which might be deemed acceptable, and thereby he was in a position to shape post-independence India's foreign policy in the most dramatic fashion. And he had a particular vision of world order and a particular vision for India, where India might fit in that emergent world order, especially as after World War II, the world was divided into 2 important camps, a socialist camp and a liberal capitalist camp led by the United States. And of course, as is well known, he pursued a strategy of non-alignment, but what is not well known is that this was not merely a strategy of steering a course between the 2 superpowers, as most people assume it was, and as popular discourse would lead us to believe, but it was essentially an attempt to fundamentally change the very texture and the quality of international politics, because there was an emphasis in Nehru's worldview on global nuclear disarmament, an issue that we are returning to once again in 2010 with President Obama's vision of a nuclear-free world, and the release just yesterday of the new American Nuclear Posture Review, which at least makes nods towards that end. But beyond that, beyond the pursuit of global nuclear disarmament, which he sought to put on the global agenda, he also sought to delegitimize colonialism and pursued a strategy of decolonization and played an important role in delegitimizing the whole idea of colonial rule. He also played a vitally important role in promoting United Nations peacekeeping, and India became one of the largest contributors to UN peacekeeping operations on a global basis. And he was also one of the first individuals to raise the very issue which became so important in the 1970s, the idea of a North-South dialogue and the redistribution of global economic resources and the addressal of global economic inequities. So India, even though it lacked material power, was not materially a particularly powerful state, having emerged from almost 190 years of British colonial rule, where there was actually significant economic contraction during colonial rule. But nevertheless, he managed to insert India in global affairs through the pursuit of a moral vision, a vision that sought to transform the global order. The problem with this strategy was that India lacked the material wherewithal to push this particular global order. Moral suasion in international politics is not irrelevant. But unless that moral suasion is backed up with material power, with either military power or significant economic power, or ideally both, it is very difficult to push forward that moral vision. But this doesn't mean that Nehru's moral vision was irrelevant. It certainly worked up to a point. Through repeated references, through attempts at multilateral diplomacy, through public diplomacy, he helped push forward the issue of UN peacekeeping, made significant contributions from the Congo to Korea in terms of UN peacekeeping, contributed to placing the issue of decolonization on the global agenda. So it's not that his moral vision was irrelevant or simply fell by the wayside, but there were distinct limits to this moral vision in the absence of significant economic and military power. At home also, he pursued, as Ambassador Desker very correctly emphasized and underscored, a strategy of import substituting industrialization and a form of namby-pamby socialism. Sadly, this strategy of economic development did not yield significant dividends for India, and India had a rather anemic record of economic growth, and not just an anemic record of economic growth, it failed to make a significant dent on rural and urban poverty. India remained mired in significant poverty, and poverty that robbed much of its citizenry of even the most elementary human decencies. And consequently, poverty is something that dogged India's footsteps, and also thereby affected its international role, as it constantly had to turn to foreign assistance to meet its various plans for industrialization, and also in its attempts to alleviate poverty at home, thereby limiting its room for international maneuver because it was so acutely dependent upon foreign assistance. But nevertheless, Nehru sought to maintain a level of independence in the conduct of India's foreign policy. Of course, Nehru's grand vision of a world where nuclear weapons would be dismantled, where the use of force would be hobbled through multilateral institutions, hence the emphasis on international peacekeeping, and the like, all came crashing down like a house of cards in 1962, when India became embroiled in a major border war with the People's Republic of China, and Indian forces were grossly unprepared, woefully under-equipped to tackle the onslaught of a battle-hardened People's Liberation Army, which inflicted a terrible defeat on the Indian forces, who fought valiantly under very adverse conditions, often without thermostatic clothing, at altitudes of 14,000 to 16,000 feet, and very frequently using World War II bolt-action Lee-Enfield rifles, and were completely suffered an utter military debacle. In the wake of this military debacle, Nehru's commitment to keeping defense expenditures low, avoiding the militarization of Indian society, and devoting whatever little resources India possessed towards poverty alleviation underwent a dramatic change. Almost overnight, after 1962, within the span of a year, Indian defense spending doubled as a percentage of GDP. India embarked on a massive program of military modernization for the creation of a 45-squadron air force, the development of a 1-million-man army with 10 mountain divisions equipped and trained for mountain warfare, and a modest program of naval modernization. Shortly thereafter, in 1962, as a broken man, with his dreams largely having vanished, Nehru perished after a second heart attack in 1964. In the wake of Nehru's death, coming to the second stage of my talk, in the wake of Nehru's death, the quest for great power status continued, but largely, and I will use a word advisedly, mostly as a form of caricature, because his successors lacked his intellectual acumen, his erudition, and his moral passion. For the most part, these were individuals, including his own daughter Indira Gandhi, who lacked that kind of extraordinary moral and intellectual prowess. And consequently, they became preoccupied with a host of domestic problems that India confronted, in part because of the failure of the strategy of import substituting industrialization, which neither contributed to dramatic and rapid industrialization, nor did it do much for promoting economic growth and reducing urban and rural poverty. But since his successors lacked the kind of intellectual ability and moral vision, India largely became marginalized in global politics. And also, within the country, it did not manage to achieve significant economic growth. In fact, there was a famous quip by a noted Indian economist, Raj Krishna, who referred to India's rate of economic growth, making a pun on the economist's term, the secular rate of growth. He called it the Hindu rate of growth. And in effect, this meant India grew at about 3% annually, with population growth rising at about 2% annually, with an effective economic growth rate of 1% annually. With this growth rate, you were never, within anyone's lifetime, about to make a significant dent on rural or urban poverty. In addition to this, India faced the looming prospect of the Malthusian nightmare, with population simply outstripping economic and agricultural resources, and faced the prospect of a famine in 1966. Fortunately, that famine was averted largely through American assistance, primarily from the Lyndon Johnson administration, though subsequently, thanks to India's rather acerbic criticisms of the conduct of war in Vietnam, the Johnson administration resorted to a rather harsh strategy referred to by some academics as the ship-to-mouth strategy, where it withheld food shipments to India until India tempered its criticism of the conduct of the war in Vietnam. In effect, it was during this period, between 1964 and 1991, that India is largely adrift. Adrift at home because of anemic levels of economic growth, with ample attempts at poverty alleviation, but achieving very little in that regard. Simultaneously, in the global order, while India continues to invoke the language of Nehru and an insistence upon the avoidance of the use of force, belief in multilateral institutions, faith in UN peacekeeping operations, and also insisting upon a global redistribution of resources, particularly in the 1970s under the aegis of the new international economic order. hardly anyone pays much heed to these demands because simply the lack of material and military power. India is simply not a significant player in the global order during this period, even though it aspires to play that role. And in addition to that, India suffers from what a noted American political scientist of Lebanese origin, Fuad Ajami, calls self-inflicted wounds. It's very difficult to talk about a redistribution of global economic resources when at home you are singularly incapable of making a dent on poverty yourself. So how do you make this moral argument for the redistribution of global resources when at home you cannot redistribute in any equitable or meaningful fashion? It is also very difficult to talk about disarmament when in 1974 you actually carry out a nuclear test of your own accord. Now, this would be much easier if India had abandoned the Nehruvian rhetoric about disarmament and simply said, look, we are faced with a threat, we have recalcitrant neighbors, we are pursuing a nuclear weapons program because it's in our national interest. That would be much more congruent with the pursuit of a nuclear weapons program rather than using the euphemism of a peaceful nuclear explosion, which no one in their right minds in the global order took seriously. It was essentially laughable to refer to something as a peaceful nuclear explosion, especially when there was overwhelming evidence from the American experience that using nuclear weapons to make fissures in the Earth's surface to release natural gas or move large amounts of Earth simply don't work because you essentially litter that area with fallout, effectively ensuring that no one would be able to go there because of the radiation that would persist for a very long period of time. So the peaceful nuclear explosion really didn't wash very well in the global community. Instead, it led to significant sanctions on India, both bilateral and multilateral, thereby significantly retarding the growth of the Indian civilian nuclear industry, let alone India's weaponization program. So in effect, I believe that this long period from 64 to 1991 is a period of muddled policy making, both domestically and internationally, which domestically meant that India's crying needs were left unmet, social, economic, political, and internationally, India faced increasing marginalization in the global order. It is really the Cold War's end that leads to the most dramatic reorientation of India's foreign and economic policies. And in large part, it is because of three important factors. Number one, because of the end of the Indo-Soviet relationship. Because as a senior Indian diplomat once told me shortly after the end of the Cold War, that this anemic successor state called Russia could not possibly play the same role of guaranteeing India's security against a possible revanchist China in the future. And consequently, India had to resort to self-help. You simply could not rely, despite the renewal of the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation of 1971 in 1991 once again, that despite the renewal of that treaty, one simply could not count on Russia to get India's chestnuts out of the fire in the event of Indian security being really imperiled. Consequently, India perforce had to make a dramatic shift in its foreign and security policy. Secondly, this strategy of economic growth that India had adopted of import substituting industrialization, which had given India some of the highest tariff barriers in the world, had not promoted competition at home, had choked off innovation at home, and had created a hothouse environment for a small handful of firms which had benefited from this closed economic system. This too had to be abandoned, especially when you looked east and looked at the dynamic quality of the states of Southeast Asia, which through an export-oriented strategy and an openness to the global economy had prospered in the most dramatic fashion. Thirdly, thanks to the collapse of the Soviet Union, India also lost significant markets in Eastern Europe for a range of shoddy goods that it produced, which no one else in the world in their right minds, except the poor, benighted Indian consumer, would purchase. And the Indian consumer had little or no choice in the matter, because those were the only goods on offer, thanks to the tariff walls that India had erected. Fortunately, in this particular moment in history, India was very lucky to have a finance minister, currently India's prime minister, a man of not only extraordinary erudition, but considerable political courage, who said that it is time that we embark on a completely different strategy of economic development. And in fact, in a rare, unguarded moment, in a public moment, he said, what is it that South Korea possesses that India does not? Considering that we started at the same level of economic growth in the late 1940s, and look where they are, and look where we are today. And then he answered his own question. He said rational economic policies, or words to that effect. Economic policies that are designed to promote innovation, competition, and an orientation towards the external world. And that is precisely what he and the Prime Minister Narasimha Rao did, and basically embarked upon a completely new economic policy for both home and abroad, despite lingering opposition from within their own party, the Congress Party, and of course the utter anachronism, historical anachronism, the communists in India, who still continue to sandbag efforts towards the pursuit of more rational economic policies. So not only was there a dramatic shift in the making of domestic economic policy, but there was also a dramatic realignment of Indian foreign and security policy. What did this involve? An end to a policy of neuralgic anti-Americanism, of criticizing the United States for real and imagined grievances, and with the emphasis mostly on the imagined, which had become a staple of Indira Gandhi's foreign policy. Second, a dramatic opening to Southeast Asia, reflected in the Look East policy from 1992, belated but nevertheless extremely important. A genuine effort, albeit somewhat unsuccessful, to improve relations with the People's Republic of China. And at another level, in terms of security policy, an explicit recognition and also, to some degree, an embrace of the utility of force in global politics, which was exemplified by the nuclear tests of 1998. That in this world, especially when you don't have a security guarantee from a superpower, and you are reliant on yourself for your own security, in a dangerous neighborhood, it makes sense to possess nuclear weapons, especially when you have adversaries who are armed with nuclear weapons. Now, this position, of course, is completely antithetical to the people who belong to the non-proliferation community. Since I'm not one of their card-carrying members, I don't have a problem with India's nuclear tests. I think it was a rational decision, and quite frankly should have come a lot earlier, and the capabilities existed as early as 1974. But because of India's material weaknesses at that time, it was unable to pursue a full-fledged nuclear arsenal. And I say this with a full recognition that there is a global movement afoot to eliminate the world of nuclear weapons. I think this is a task that is going to be much harder than many of its proponents envisage. But that's the subject of another lecture on another occasion. Let me return to the subject at hand. What have been the results of this dramatic transformation of Indian foreign and security policy? And that's what I'm going to try and outline in the next section, and then finally conclude by talking about the challenges that still lie ahead both domestically and internationally. The results, the economic results, have been nothing short of dramatic. There has been a reduction in absolute poverty since 1991 from about 36% of the population to about 25%. That's still cold comfort, because when you talk about 25%, and with the numbers that one is dealing with in India, that's still 250 million people, not an insignificant figure. However, 260 million Indians are now part of the middle class, defined by the ability to purchase a basket of goods, and 60 million enjoying a per capita income, which is the average of Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. This is not a trivial achievement. Annual economic growth has also dramatically increased, and just to give you a sense, between 2004 and 2008, it clocked at 7.2%. Despite a global economic recession, India will probably continue to grow around 7% this year. And I think this is eminently sustainable. Indian economists and policy planners are now talking about double-digit growth, a notion that would have never entered their heads during that long period of namby-pamby socialism. And Indian entrepreneurs, whose sort of animal spirits have been unleashed, now are global entrepreneurs running global companies, and even iconic firms. And this is a certain irony here, that now India owns Jaguar and no longer the British. And you may detect some sense of residual Indian nationalism in me when I refer to this, because now one of the iconic cars manufactured by the former colonial power is now in the hands of a former colony. And thank you very much, it's doing very well. Other achievements. The breaking of one of the most important infrastructural bottlenecks, telephones. I recall living in India when one had to book a telephone call when you wanted to make a call to another city. Today, if you were to talk to a youngster in India, he would wonder if you came from the age of the dinosaurs. Because today the Indian cell phone market is growing at about 16 million a month and has contributed currently to 580 million mobile phone subscribers, making it the fastest mobile phone market in the world. There are other infrastructural bottlenecks that continue to hobble India's economic growth, but telecommunications is not one of them. It is, in fact, my American iPhone now feels a bit out of place when I go to India, because others sport things which I haven't even heard of. At a strategic level, there are three critical changes that have emerged and which hold out the possibility of India finally realizing its dream of great power status. In at least three major emergent global regimes, what India thinks of and acts on will have a significant impact on the future of these regimes. They include non-proliferation, climate change, and trade. In all these three regimes, India's participation and India's imaginative policymaking will have a significant impact on the character and the features of these regimes. Second, India now is a potential candidate for the Security Council, despite significant opposition from particular quarters. But nevertheless, it has now the prospect of membership in the Security Council. The terms of such membership, obviously, are the subject of considerable debate and will remain so for the foreseeable future. Third, it has already demonstrated a capacity to deliver public goods in the region and beyond, from counterterrorism to humanitarian assistance. In the wake of 9/11, Indian ships participated, Indian naval vessels participated in providing assistance to American vessels from all the way from the Bay of Bengal to the Straits of Malacca. India has participated in global anti-piracy operations in the region, and in the wake of the December tsunami, Indian naval vessels were amongst the first to reach portions of Indonesia and participated in the ad hoc coalition led by the United States to provide comfort and solace to the victims of the Christmas tsunami. So the capacity of India to provide regional and global public goods is growing and will increase in the foreseeable future as the country pursues a more assertive foreign and security and humanitarian policy in the region and beyond. That said, despite all these significant achievements, both at home and abroad, and the prospect of doing more, both domestically and externally, for the good of India's population and for the possibility of providing global public goods, there are important and significant challenges that India still confronts. And it would be dishonest, both intellectually and personally on my part, if I did not underscore the limitations that India still confronts, which remain real. Not to in any way denigrate its significant achievements since the early 1990s. What are the challenges that lie ahead? They're hardly trivial. Let me first outline certain challenges in terms of economic growth and governance. And the two, in my judgment, especially as a political scientist, go hand in hand. To begin with, 400 to 500 million Indians still lack access to electricity. This is not the hallmark of a great power. This is not a non-trivial problem. India is making significant investments in energy, from nuclear energy to solar power, but the pace has to be dramatically increased if it is going to reach these 400 to 500 million people who not only don't get access to electricity, remain mired in significant poverty as a consequence thereof. 455 million Indians live on less than $1.25 a day. And yes, I know about purchasing power parity, but that's still abysmally low. I have some sense of what $1.25 will buy you in India. And that is, again, a significant hurdle to great power status. 230 million Indians go hungry every day, according to the World Food Program. These are figures, sadly, one has to take seriously. The World Food Program does not invent figures just on the, in a casual fashion. And yet, it's not as if India lacks the ability to feed its population. As the noted Indian economist Amartya Sen has pointed out, that the market mechanism does not always work, especially when it comes to food. And this is a point worth underscoring, because thanks to the inefficacy of the distribution system, including a public distribution system that exists in India, there's as much as 50 million tons of food grain in government warehouses. And yet, you have persistent hunger. This is an institutional failure. And this is not something, it's not a failure of production, but it is an institutional failure because institutions cannot reach that segment of the population which still goes to bed hungry every day. And perhaps one of India's most abject failures, 62% of the population is literate today, after 63 years of independence. Again, not the hallmark of a great power. The abject neglect of primary education in India and the privileging of higher education in large part explains the failure of promoting literacy. Now, obviously, one could point to the success of particular states, but that's not what matters. What matters is the aggregate figure, and the aggregate figure is still a sign of failure. And without a significant dent in literacy, India's ability to sustain growth and also to alleviate poverty will be significantly constrained. Literacy is a critical tool for the ability to earn an honest day's living. And consequently, this is an issue that India will now have to address. It has passed a Right to Education Act belatedly in 2009, but it remains to be seen how efficaciously this act will actually be implemented and thereby make a dent on this crying need. What are the strategic challenges then India faces beyond questions of economic growth and governance? I can identify at least three, which I believe are critical. One, unfortunately, was underscored this morning's paper. 75 members of India's Central Reserve Police forces were killed in an ambush and rather brutally massacred by neophyte Maoist guerrillas, who now operate, sometimes with impunity, in 20 states of India. And the Prime Minister, to his credit, has correctly and publicly identified this as the single most important internal security threat facing India. This is a threat that will not go away simply through deft counterinsurgency techniques, but will involve better governance, the delivery of services to people who feel marginalized, citizenry who feel disaffected from the Indian state, and who feel that the Indian state has been unresponsive to its needs. No amount of deft tinkering with a counterinsurgency strategy is going to suppress the underlying sources of this discord that seems to rack significant parts of India. This is not in any way to decry the counterinsurgency efforts, but the counterinsurgency efforts must also be coupled with better governance, better institutions, more responsive institutions, and more inclusive institutions that don't leave out India's citizenry from its dramatic surge of economic growth that it has recently experienced. Second, India needs to also forthrightly come to terms with, and I know I'm dealing with an extremely sensitive subject, so I will choose my words carefully, with homegrown Islamist terror. And in large part, this has to do, again, with the feeling of marginalization that some segments of the Muslim community feel in India as a consequence of the policies of the past, not the policies of the present government, but because they have faced discrimination in various aspects of Indian life and have now turned to the siren call of global jihad. This does not mean that there is a seamless connection between disaffected Muslims and Al-Qaeda. I would be foolish to suggest any such connection. But there is a problem with a minuscule segment of the Muslim population which feels that they are not within the ambit of India's institutional and political life and cannot simply express their grievances through parliamentary and electoral means, and hence now feel that they must resort to violence. This is something that India will have to confront, and not only merely through the means of better policing, better intelligence collection, but through the redressal of perceived grievances of a small but growing number within India's very substantial Muslim community. Finally, at an international level, India will have to forge a strategy, and a strategy that is not ad hoc, that is not reactive, that doesn't respond to what transpired last week, but a long-term strategy of how to live with a behemoth neighbor, and a behemoth neighbor with whom it has an ongoing border dispute, and with whom it is in a competitive relationship with in Asia, namely the People's Republic of China. This does not mean an automatically hostile relationship, but it is a relationship that will have to be managed, for which India will have to develop a long-term strategy. India will have to make sufficient investments to ensure that it can protect its national security without being needlessly provocative, without needlessly getting into a possible spiral of an arms race, or needlessly finding reasons to be at odds with the People's Republic of China, but nevertheless to forge a strategy that guarantees India's legitimate national security interests while at the same time maintaining a modicum of peace and pursuing the other aspects of the relationship, including a burgeoning economic relationship, which has grown most dramatically despite ongoing border tensions and despite competition in third areas. Since the end of the Cold War, India has come much closer to the realization of Nehru's dream that someday India would take its legitimate place in the Committee of Nations. Today, it is no longer based upon notions of moral suasion. It's no longer based upon an ideational view of the world. India no longer seeks to transform the global order, but today India has the material wherewithal, or at least the beginnings of a material wherewithal, to be able to play a critical role in shaping important global regimes and also helping to create perhaps a more just, fair, and peaceable global order. Thank you very much.